Hi, welcome back to Subcase number 2, Introduction to the Human Rights Impacts of Unconventional Gas. In Subcase 2, we're investigating the impacts of unconventional gas as far as the infrastructure goes. So, the infrastructure subcase will examine the human rights and earth rights impacts resulting from unconventional gas infrastructures such as pipelines, compressor stations, export facilities, liquid natural gas facilities, storage facilities, and so on. So we're inviting you to provide testimonial witness statements supporting this subcase, to encourage you to undertake that activity and to give you a bit of information about the approach that we're taking with this particular subcase. I've put together a little bit of information in the following slides to get that process happening. So, in summary, the points of evidence that we'd like to address in this subcase includes things like the vast infrastructure and the way it is pockmarked across the landscape, industrialising the rural amenity. It has had an adverse physical and economic impact on property values that are attributable directly to the activities that are undertaken by the industry and the exposures that are associated with the industry. There's vast amounts of land that are being purchased by these multinational companies. There's huge ponds that are installed. There's infrastructure installed, buyouts and walk-offs. The infrastructure and the associated noise, dust, light, traffic, loss of privacy, impact all on the economy, the viability, the impact on business methods. They encroach on time. They compromise families' ability to enjoy and use their property. There's loss of property value also attributed to the impacts of the infrastructure of the industry. There's also a lack of design and cost margins. That means that there is no valves or procedures in place to prevent the need to release 90 kilometres worth of gas in a pipeline, for example, in order to just undertake maintenance on one valve. So if we were to look at the map of Chinchilla area again, on this side of the map, you see the petroleum leases that are issued by the government in a very arbitrary manner to the individual unconventional gas companies. Each of these squares is a petroleum lease. But if you were to look at the cadastral boundaries or the property boundaries for individual people who live underneath those petroleum leases, you see that the petroleum leases are completely arbitrary. They don't follow cadastral maps. They don't follow those boundaries. So that in itself is where the picture begins as far as this infrastructure and its impact on the existing land use. The geospatial dispersion of the industry is intense. So whereas one mine might undertake a few kilometres, this industry has massive broad community impacts, including social, demographic and health outcomes that differ from other developments like a mine, specifically because of the geospatial dispersion of the gas activities and the uncertainties and potential environmental impacts. So this image here identifies, the numerous elements of the industry and its infrastructure. This is an industry document that we have obtained from a landholder that identifies the way in which the landscape is industrialised with the infrastructure and the impression that the companies have of what used to be someone's home, someone's property. It's now turned into basically a production field or a construction zone that has no resemblance to someone's actual home or business. This is how incredibly intense and dense the infrastructure and the impact is. So let's talk about the bits of infrastructure that there are in the industry. So this is just a starter list. So first of all, we've already discussed the arbitrary laying over of the tenement across normal cadastral boundaries. Then there's the exploration activities. the first stage of the industry, the surveying that's undertaken, the road and intersection works that are undertaken, the water trucks transporting fresh water to the operation, wastewater trucks transporting waste from the operation, lease pad preparation, including the clearing of vegetation, trucks removing wood chips to unknown locations, vehicle movements, drilling up to 6 horizontal wells from one surface well, high point vents, low point drains, risers, above ground valves, manholes, worker accommodation, prefab cement paths over pipe crossings, access roads to and from all of the infrastructure, underground storage of gas, large quantities of gas stored in underground in underground depleted conventional gas fields, ponds, massive ponds, infield compressing, pipelines and right-of-way, workers accessing properties for operational and maintenance activities, gas processing plants, flares, venting, water treatment plants, workover drills, the distribution, export pipelines, compressions and shipment, telecommunication, and the electricity distribution system. It's just a basic list of, just a starter list of infrastructure that this industry requires. So we're going to go on now and identify some of the infrastructure by way of visual examples. So this is an example of an evening sky. Actually, it's a nighttime sky, and you can see the impact of 3 flares there on the person's amenity. So these flares can be seen for kilometres, and they turn the night sky into day. This is the flare occurring in the daytime. It's quite significant flame. The noise that's associated with that is another issue, not to mention the incomplete combustion, the emissions, the noise, the light, and of course the risk that comes with an open flame in a very dry country. This is a multi-pad well, so where many of the initial wells have been one particular well per pad. They have started to address several issues with the industry by putting multiple wells upon one pad. This is an example of the above ground infrastructure that we were discussing before. So this is a vent on a well. This is a high point vent that is on the water line. This is another vent that's out of the well pad, out onto an external valve on a riser. This is an actual well pad. This is an example of the pipeline infrastructure being laid and what is left behind once they have installed the pipeline and moved on. It is not all over. There is still ongoing impacts to the area in which this activity has been undertaken. This is an example of subsidence. So a pipeline that has been installed, the company has moved on, there's been some weather, and a significant subsidence of the installation. This is an example of a low point drain, and what's happening here is there's been wildlife that has died in this open pit, which is another part of the infrastructure. You can also see the impact of this infrastructure on the overland flow. So low point drains, by virtue of what they are actually doing in the system, is collecting water as it drops out of the gas, as it's transported from A to B. These are naturally placed in a low point because that is the effect that it has in the system. On low points on people's property is obviously parts of the overland flow. Now this is permanently interrupted and potentially a source of contamination for overland flow for that farmer's property. Obviously it's a source of danger for wildlife as well, not to mention small children if they were to get in to investigate such an open pit with water and who knows what else in the contamination as far as the water goes. High point vents are designed to leak. This high point vent has been leaking for an untold number of days. The industry haven't noticed it. The farmer is the one who had to report the spill to the industry and to the Environmental Authority. This is well and truly over 5,000 litres of raw processed water from the gas extraction system. And this spill alone had an impact on the sodium absorption ratio of the soil. So imagine that over thousands of other high point vents on properties. These spills and leaks are designed into the system. This is an example of how the community has changed. So this industry, this is just a corner road, and in a community where they're starting to install wells, all of a sudden this bus stop becomes the industry's laid down yard and maintenance yard. So there's no consideration given to the people who are already living in that community. This is an example of prefabricated cement that's placed over pipelines to enable the heavier machinery like workover rigs to come across existing pipelines that have been installed. This is a person's property. It's not a highway, it's not a roadway. This is private property and a roadway that the industry has installed on that property to access the wells. So as far as infrastructure goes, this is each one of these labels here indicate a central processing plant of one sort or another. And that is just in a very small area. It's quite a dense amount of industrialisation. Here's Chinchilla and here's Dalby. And look at the multiple of construction of gas processing plants. This is an example of the impact that the infrastructure can have without even entering an area as yet. So all of those yellow triangles are where there are wells, and you can see that this area here hasn't been explored as yet. That is the next area for installation of wells. Each one of these white dots here is a stock and domestic water bore that is owned and operated by farmers on those properties. So before the gas wells are even installed in this area, each one of these stock and domestic water bores had spectacularly failed within a 12-month period prior to any wells being installed. So the front line of this industry has quite a significant impact on an area that's not even got wells as yet. So this is also the area that is on the Condamine River that is bubbling at the moment. So you can see that without having an infrastructure immediately around the area, there's already an impact on the underground water. This is an example of a spectacularly failing stock and domestic water bore. So the stock and domestic water bore, instead of sitting quietly waiting to be used or pumped for access for the farmer for his stock or domestic use, this water bore is now so full of gas that the gas is lifting the water from the aquifer out onto the property in an uncontrolled manner. This is a picture of the bubbling Condamine River. Another aspect of the infrastructure is the massive high voltage power transmission lines that are installed expressly for the use of the industry. So the industry establishes direct connections into the high voltage transmission electricity network for the CSG processing facilities, and further solely for the benefit and profit of the privately owned companies and their shareholders. This is a result of further inappropriate planning and classification. So, for example, these massive high voltage power lines expressly for the use of the industry are classified as community infrastructure. And accordingly, then, they fall outside the otherwise industry impact assessments. And the farmers and landholders who are impacted by the installation of this are not caught up in the usual standard method of dealing with the industry. They fall outside of it. There's land resumptions and there's other impacts on landholders that are not otherwise accommodated for or dealt with. There are other areas that are impacted by the infrastructure. So here we've got a picture, for example, of the 3 large facilities that were developed cookie cutters. The same facility repeated 3 times for 3 different projects, purely for exporting the gas to overseas. So that's a massive impact, not just on that piece of land, but for that entire community. And of course, what goes along with those sorts of facilities are massive flares, which have also having an impact on that particular community. So that's just a sample of the type of things that we're looking at as far as evidence, testimony, and witness statements going towards supporting this subcase, which is the subcase of the impacts on the human rights as far as infrastructure of this industry goes. Please contact us with your testimony, and we'd be happy to talk to you, talk through the process of presenting that testimony. So, thank you again for listening, and I look forward to coming back to you with subcase number 3.